You're probably someone who handles things. You don't call people when you're struggling. You don't ask for help unless you absolutely have to. You've been told you're closed off or cold. And honestly, that annoys you because you don't feel cold. You feel fine. You've built a life that works. You have your thing. You don't need a lot of people. Most of the time, that feels like a superpower. But here's what nobody talks about. That independence. It's not actually independence. It's a nervous system that decided, a very long time ago, that needing people is dangerous. It's been protecting you from that danger ever since, even when there's nothing left to protect you from. What you're dealing with has a name. It's called avoidant attachment, and it doesn't look like most people think it does. It doesn't look like someone who can't function. It looks like someone who functions so well alone that connection starts to feel like a threat. I've spent a lot of time researching this: attachment theory, nervous system science, developmental psychology, and I want to show you exactly what this pattern looks like, where it comes from, and what it costs you, not in a clinical way, in a real way. Here's what we're covering. Why avoidant attachment is the hardest pattern to spot, because it looks like confidence. Then, the specific childhood experience that builds this wiring. Then, the trap it creates in your adult relationships. And finally, what actually changes it. Because, just open up is not an answer, and you probably already know that. Let's get into it. Most people, when they hear attachment issues, picture someone who's a mess, clingy, crying at 2 a.m., falling apart over a text. That's not you. Avoidant attachment looks almost the opposite. It looks like someone who's together, self-reliant, capable, private. You don't need a lot of reassurance. You don't blow up relationships. You just quietly pull back. You go quiet when things get intense. You feel a strange resistance when someone gets too close too fast. And here's the specific thing to look for. It's not that you don't want closeness. It's that when closeness actually arrives, real closeness, the kind where someone sees you and wants more of you, something in you flinches. You can't fully explain it. You just feel this urge to create space. In psychology, this is called deactivating. Your nervous system interprets emotional intimacy as a threat and starts pulling the wires. Distance becomes safety. Alone becomes neutral. And from the outside, that just looks like you having your life together. That's what makes this pattern so hard to catch. It's disguised as a personality. It's disguised as strength. But strength and avoidance are not the same thing. And most avoidants go years, sometimes decades, without knowing the difference. That's just the surface. But what actually builds this wiring in the first place? That's where it gets uncomfortable, because it starts way earlier than you probably think. Here's the thing about attachment styles. They're not personality traits you're born with. They're learned responses. Specifically, they're what a child's nervous system builds when it's trying to answer one question. Is it safe to need the people around me? For kids who develop avoidant attachment, the answer they learned was, not really. It doesn't always come from dramatic trauma. Sometimes it's more subtle than that. An emotionally unavailable parent, not cruel, just not there. A home where vulnerability was ignored or dismissed. Where crying was met with, you're fine. Where asking for comfort created awkward silence or mild irritation. The child learns something very specific from that. When I express a need, it doesn't get met, and sometimes it makes things worse. So the brain does what brains do. It adapts. It builds a system that suppresses the need before it can be expressed. Over time, that suppression becomes so automatic, so deeply wired, that you stop being aware of the need at all. This is what researchers call learned deactivation of the attachment system. And here's the painful part. It worked. As a kid, it genuinely worked. Needing less meant getting hurt less. Independence meant survival. Your nervous system solved a real problem. The problem is it never stopped running that solution. So now, as a fully grown adult in safe relationships, with people who actually want to show up for you, the same system kicks in. Same flinch. Same pull toward distance. Not because anyone's hurting you, but because your brain hasn't been given a reason to update the original file. You're not broken. You were adaptive. But the adaptation has an expiration date, and you might have blown past it years ago. Here's where it gets even more frustrating. This pattern doesn't just make closeness uncomfortable. It actually creates evidence that you were right to protect yourself. Let me show you exactly how. This is the part most people miss. Avoidant attachment doesn't just make you pull back. It creates a feedback loop that keeps reconfirming the original belief that needing people leads to pain. Here's how it works in real time. Someone gets close to you. You feel the flinch, that pull toward space, so you create distance. Maybe you go quiet. Maybe you get busy. Maybe you become slightly less available. The other person feels it. They don't always name it, but they feel the temperature drop. So they do one of two things. They pull back and start to disconnect, which you interpret as confirmation that people leave, people aren't reliable, and closeness is temporary. Or they lean in harder, which triggers your deactivation more, pushes them further away, and eventually makes them leave. And again, confirmation. Either way, the story gets reinforced. I was right not to need anyone. You never get the data that would contradict it. This is called a confirmation loop, and it's one of the most elegant, invisible traps in all of relational psychology. The avoidance behavior literally produces the outcome that justifies the avoidance. And because it's unconscious, you're not doing this on purpose. It just feels like life keeps proving the same thing to you. People always go. Closeness always gets complicated. Being alone is just easier. It's not a coincidence. It's a pattern. And patterns can be interrupted. But first, there's one more piece you need to understand. Because there's a specific person your nervous system tends to pull toward. And that's not an accident either. If you've ever found yourself in a push-pull dynamic, where you're distant, and the other person is desperate, this next part explains exactly why that keeps happening. Here's something that sounds counterintuitive until you see it. Avoidant attachers and anxious attachers are magnetically drawn to each other. The anxious person, someone who craves reassurance, fears abandonment, and reaches out often, is exactly the kind of person who triggers the avoidance defense system. That pushes the avoidant away. That confirms the anxious person's fear of abandonment. That makes them work harder. That pushes the avoidant further. It's a perfect, miserable machine. And both people feel like the other is the problem. The avoidant thinks, why can't they just calm down and give me space? The anxious person thinks, why can't they just show up and stop running? Neither of them is the villain. Both are running very old programming in very new situations. But here's what makes this especially tricky for the avoidant. The anxious person's need, that desperation, that reaching, actually feels familiar in a specific way. Not comfortable, but familiar, like the emotional temperature of your childhood home, where love was there but inconsistent, where you had to manage the emotional space. So you keep finding yourself in the same dynamic. Different person, same pattern, same exhaustion. And the solution that seems obvious, find someone more chill, someone who doesn't need much, often doesn't work either. Because with a secure person who doesn't chase, the avoidant often feels nothing, no spark, too easy. And that absence of tension gets mistaken for an absence of chemistry. The nervous system mistakes regulation for boredom. This is one of the most important things to understand, because it means the solution isn't just finding a different person, it's doing something in you first. And that's exactly what the last part is about, because there is a way through this. But it's probably not what you've been told. If you've ever looked up avoidant attachment, you've probably gotten some version of the same advice. Communicate more, open up, let people in. That's not wrong, but it's incomplete in a way that makes it almost useless. Here's the actual mechanism of change. Avoidant attachment doesn't change because you decide to be more vulnerable. It changes because your nervous system gets enough corrective experiences to update the original file. A corrective experience is a moment when the old prediction fails to come true. You express a need, and it gets met. You show vulnerability, and it's held, not dismissed. You stay in the discomfort of closeness, and nothing bad happens. Over time, with enough of those moments, the brain starts to revise the original conclusion. Needing people might be okay. Closeness might be survivable. But here's what that requires. You have to catch the deactivation before it fires fully. That moment right before you go quiet, right before you create distance, is the window. It's not about forcing yourself to feel things. It's about pausing the automatic response long enough to make a different choice, even a small one. Send the message instead of waiting to cool off. Say, "I'm struggling," to one person instead of handling it completely alone. Let someone help you with something you could technically do yourself. Small, consistent, repeated. That's how nervous systems change. Not through a single breakthrough conversation, not through an intense emotional moment, through accumulated evidence, drip by drip, that this time, it's safe. If you want to go deeper into the neuroscience and relational science behind how attachment styles change, there's a framework I've put together that covers the full rewiring process. It takes everything we talked about today and gives you a step-by-step look at how the nervous system responds to new relational experiences. Links in the description. It builds directly on what we just covered. If you've ever looked up avoidant attachment, you've probably gotten some version of the same advice. Communicate more, open up, let people in. That's not wrong, but it's incomplete in a way that makes it almost useless. Here's the actual mechanism of change. Avoidant attachment doesn't change because you decide to be more vulnerable. It changes because your nervous system gets enough corrective experiences to update the original file. A corrective experience is a moment when the old prediction fails to come true. You express a need, and it gets met. You show vulnerability, and it's held, not dismissed. You stay in the discomfort of closeness, and nothing bad happens. Over time, with enough of those moments, the brain starts to revise the original conclusion. Needing people might be okay. Closeness might be survivable. But here's what that requires. You have to catch the deactivation before it fires fully. That moment right before you go quiet, right before you create distance, is the window. It's not about forcing yourself to feel things. It's about pausing the automatic response long enough to make a different choice, even a small one. Send the message instead of waiting to cool off. Say, "I'm struggling," to one person instead of handling it completely alone. Let someone help you with something you could technically do yourself. Small, consistent, repeated. That's how nervous systems change. Not through a single breakthrough conversation, not through an intense emotional moment, through accumulated evidence, drip by drip, that this time, it's safe. If you want to go deeper into the neuroscience and relational science behind how attachment styles change, there's a framework I've put together that covers the full rewiring process. It takes everything we talked about today and gives you a step-by-step look at how the nervous system responds to new relational experiences. Links in the description. It builds directly on what we just covered. Here's what you now know that most people walking around with this pattern don't. Your independence isn't a flaw. It was an answer. The most intelligent one your younger self could find, given what was available. The brain isn't broken when it avoids. It's doing exactly what it learned to do. But you're not a kid anymore. The tools that kept you safe at 7 don't serve you at 30. The real work isn't about forcing yourself to need people. It's about giving your nervous system enough evidence, slowly, deliberately, that needing people doesn't have to mean what it used to. You came into this video wondering why closeness feels like a trap. Now you know it was never about closeness. It was about what closeness taught you the first time around. And that's a story you can actually rewrite.